Welcome back to Revenge Room. If you're new here, this is the place where betrayal meets justice, where the people who thought they could destroy someone's life learn the hardest lesson of all. Today's story is called My Son Gave the 5.2 business I built to his wife's family. 3 months later, they begged me back. Imagine spending 40 years of your life building something from nothing. You sacrifice everything, you pour your soul into every brick, every contract, every handshake. Your wife stands beside you through the hardest years until cancer takes her away. And then your only son, the person you trusted to carry your legacy forward, looks you in the eye at a dinner table surrounded by his in-laws and says, "Dad, you're old now. Just hand it over. My wife has a business degree. She deserves this more than you." They laughed. They actually laughed while waiting for him to sign away everything his parents built. But here is what they did not expect. He did not argue. He didn't cry. He simply smiled, signed the papers, and walked away. That smile haunted them for months because they had no idea what was coming. You see, his late wife had prepared something before she died. Secret that would turn their victory into the worst mistake of their lives. 3 months later, the same people who pushed him out were standing at his door, desperate, broken, begging for mercy. Stay until the very end, because what happens next will remind you why you never underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. This is not just a story. This is justice served cold. My name is Richard Hale. I am 68 years old, a businessman who spent 4 decades building something I believed would outlast me. I live in Texas now, in a quiet house that still smells faintly of my late wife's lilies, surrounded by memories of a life that taught me everything about love and eventually everything about betrayal. 40 years ago, Margaret and I started with nothing. I mean truly nothing. Our first office was a rented room above a hardware store furnished with a desk we found at a garage sale and 2 chairs that wobbled if you leaned back too far. We had $300 in the bank, a stack of business cards Margaret printed at the library, and a dream that most people told us was foolish. Her parents said we should wait. My father said I should get a real job with a pension. But Margaret looked at me one night over cold coffee and said, "Richard, if we wait for permission, we will wait forever. Let us build something that is ours." So we did. She handled the books because numbers made sense to her in ways they never did to me. She could look at a spreadsheet and see the future, see where we were bleeding money and where we could grow. I was the one who shook hands, who sat across from clients and convinced them to take a chance on a company no one had heard of. Margaret called me the face. She called herself the brain. But the truth is, we were both the heart. Those early years nearly broke us more than once. We survived 3 recessions. We lost clients who swore they would stay forever. We had a year where I didn't take a salary for 8 months straight, and Margaret sold her mother's pearl earrings without telling me until I found the pawn receipt in her coat pocket. But the moment that still wakes me up at night was 1987, when a deal fell through and we faced bankruptcy. I came home ready to tell her it was over. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and a folder of papers. She had mortgaged our house, our home, behind my back. "I fixed it," she said simply. "Now stop looking at me like that and go save our company." That was Margaret. She never waited for storms to pass. She walked straight into them and dared them to knock her down. We grew. Year by year, client by client, we built something that mattered. And Margaret, she made sure it was never just about profit. She knew every employee by name. She remembered their birthdays, their children's graduations, the names of their dogs. When someone's mother passed away, Margaret sent flowers and a handwritten note. When someone's kid got into college, she baked a cake herself. "A business is not just numbers," she used to say. "It is the people who believe in you. Take care of them, and they will take care of everything else." When she got sick, those people proved her right. Employees who had been with us for 20 years visited her hospital room more often than some of our own relatives. They brought soup books, photographs from company picnics she had organized. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lasted 14, not because of medicine, but because Margaret refused to leave until she was ready. Her final months were busy in ways I did not understand at the time. She spent hours with our lawyer, an old friend named Daniel Brooks. She organized files I had never seen. She wrote letters and sealed them in envelopes with instructions I thought were just the wishes of a dying woman being thorough. I didn't realize she was preparing for something specific. something she saw coming that I was too blind to notice. Margaret always said she could read people better than any book. I wish I'd listened more carefully. After she passed, I tried to honor her by investing in our son. Evan was 35, then smart, capable, the only child Margaret and I ever had. He had worked at the company for years in various roles, learning the business from the inside. I began transitioning leadership to him, teaching him what his mother had taught me. I believed he would carry our legacy forward. I wanted to believe it so badly that I ignored the signs. The way Evan grew distant after his wedding, the new influences that seemed to speak through him. The way his eyes, once warm, had turned calculating in ways that reminded me of someone else entirely. I gave my son everything his mother and I had built. I believed he would protect it. I was wrong. The change did not happen overnight. It crept in slowly, the way rot spreads through wood, invisible until the structure begins to crack. Looking back now, I can trace the beginning of everything to a single event, my son's wedding. 6 years ago, Evan married Lydia Whitmore. She was 35 at the time, polished and precise with an MBA from a prestigious university and the kind of confidence that filled every room she entered. She spoke about business the way some people speak about religion, with absolute certainty and little patience for doubt. I tried to like her. I tried to see what Evan saw. But from the very first dinner with her family, something felt wrong in a way I could not name. Thomas Whitmore. Lydia's father was a man who believed his own voice was the most important sound in any room. He dominated the conversation that night with opinions about markets and investments and strategies, none of which anyone had asked for. He talked about his consulting work as if he had built empires, though I later learned he had never run a company of his own. Janice, Lydia's mother, sat beside him, draped in jewelry that glittered under the restaurant lights. Diamonds at her ears and throat that seemed designed to announce wealth before she even spoke. But I noticed something odd about those stones. They caught the light wrong. The sparkle was too sharp, too artificial. Margaret noticed it too. Under the table, she squeezed my hand, and later in the car, she whispered, "Those diamonds are cubic zirconia, Richard. I wonder what else they are faking." I should have listened to her. Margaret could read people better than any book, and she had seen something in the Whitmores that I was too polite to acknowledge. But Evan was happy, or at least he seemed happy, and I convinced myself that my wife was simply being protective of our only son. I let the moment pass. I let a lot of moments pass in those years, and each one cost me more than I knew. After the wedding, the changes in Evan accelerated. He had always been respectful of my experience, always asked questions before making decisions. But gradually those questions stopped. Meetings were scheduled when I was supposedly resting. Decisions were made behind closed doors and presented to me as finalized plans. When I asked why I had not been consulted about a new hire, Evan said the team had handled it. When I questioned a risky expansion into a market we knew nothing about, Lydia smiled at me with that polished patience of hers and said, "Times have changed, Dad. Trust us." The word "dad" from her lips always sounded like a costume she wore poorly, something borrowed rather than earned. Thomas Whitmore began appearing at company events. He called it networking. He offered consulting opinions to employees who had never asked for them and spoke about our operations as if he understood them better than the people who had built them. Janice started joining family dinners more frequently, dropping hints about how modern families share resources, how successful businesses evolve when younger generations take the lead. I felt the ground shifting beneath me, but I told myself it was natural. Parents step back, children step forward. That is how life works. What I could not explain was Evan himself. He had become nervous in ways that didn't match the confident executive he was supposed to be growing into. At dinners, his phone always sat face down on the table and he checked it constantly with quick, almost guilty glances. He laughed too loud at his father-in-law's jokes and agreed too quickly with Lydia's suggestions. I assumed it was the stress of new responsibilities. I assumed he was simply adjusting to marriage and leadership at the same time. I did not realize that my son was carrying a weight I could not see, trapped in something that had grown beyond his control. I misread his anxiety as ambition. I misread his silence as focus. I misread everything. Then came the dinner invitation. It arrived on a Tuesday, hand-delivered by Lydia herself, which should have been my first warning. She smiled as she handed me the envelope and said the family wanted to discuss the future of the company. Evan stood behind her, not meeting my eyes. The invitation was addressed to me, but it felt less like family and more like a verdict already written. The Whitmore home was exactly what I should have expected, and nothing like what it pretended to be. It sat on 2 acres of manicured lawn, in a neighborhood where every house competed to look more impressive than its neighbor. The driveway was lined with solar lights that clicked on as I pulled in, illuminating a path to a front door that seemed designed for magazine photographs rather than actual living. As I walked toward it that evening, I remember thinking the place felt like a stage set, beautiful from a distance, but somehow hollow up close. Thomas greeted me at the door with a handshake that lasted too long and a smile that never reached his eyes. He launched immediately into conversation about his new yacht, a 40-foot vessel he had purchased the month before for weekend trips along the coast. He described the wood finishes, the navigation system, the custom upholstery, all while leading me through a foyer decorated with art I suspected was chosen by a decorator rather than by taste. Janice appeared from the kitchen carrying a bottle of wine that she announced cost $300, as if the price tag was the most important thing about it. I accepted a glass and said nothing. Margaret had taught me long ago that people who announce the cost of things are usually trying to convince themselves more than anyone else. The dining room was formal in a way that felt exhausting. Crystal glasses, china plates with gold-trimmed cloth napkins folded into elaborate shapes. Lydia sat at the head of the table, which struck me as strange since this was her parents' home, not hers. She looked comfortable there, as if she had been rehearsing for this position her entire life. Evan sat to her right, and when I took my seat across from him, he did not meet my eyes. He stared at his wine glass, turning the stem between his fingers, and I felt the distance between us like a physical weight in the room. Dinner passed in a blur of small talk I barely remember. Thomas described a European vacation they had taken in the spring, 3 weeks in Italy and France, first-class flights, and 5-star hotels. Janice added details about the shopping, the restaurants, the private tours of vineyards. They spoke as if wealth was something they had always possessed, rather than something they were desperate to project. I nodded and smiled, and counted the minutes until whatever was really happening would finally reveal itself. It came after dessert. Lydia cleared her throat with the precision of someone who had practiced this moment in front of a mirror. The table went quiet. Even Thomas stopped talking, which I had begun to think was physically impossible for him. "Dad?" Lydia began, and the words still felt wrong coming from her. "We have been thinking about the company's future. The market is changing faster than ever. Technology competition, consumer expectations. We need leadership that understands the modern landscape. Someone with current credentials and fresh perspectives." She paused, letting the words settle, then slid a folder across the table toward me. "We are proposing a leadership transition. You would retain an honorary title, of course. Chairman Emeritus. A comfortable retirement with full benefits. You have earned that." She smiled, but it was the smile of someone closing a deal, not someone speaking to family. "The papers inside outline the transfer of operational control. We would just need your signature to make it official." I opened the folder. The documents were professionally prepared, every clause designed to strip away everything Margaret and I had built while making it sound like a gift. Transfer of authority. Effective. Immediately. My hands did not shake as I read. I would not give them that. I looked up at my son. "Evan, is this what you want?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like hours. Evan finally raised his eyes to meet mine, and I saw something there I had never seen before. Not guilt, not hesitation, but a kind of resigned surrender, as if he had already made peace with what he was about to do. "Dad," he said quietly, "you are 68. You are old now. The company needs to evolve. Lydia has the education, the vision. This is the right move for everyone." Thomas chuckled softly from his end of the table. Janice nodded with an expression of approval that made my stomach turn. And something inside me, something that had survived 4 decades of business, the loss of my wife and every hardship life had thrown at me, went very still, very quiet. I felt it settle into place like a door closing. They expected tears. They expected shouting arguments, the desperate protests of an old man who could not accept his own irrelevance. That is what they had prepared for. That is why Lydia's speech had been so polished, why the papers were ready, why the entire evening had been choreographed down to the seating arrangement. But I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I looked at each of them in turn. Thomas with his borrowed confidence, Janice with her fake diamonds, Evan with his hollow eyes, and finally Lydia, who had orchestrated all of it. Then I smiled. It was not a defeated smile. It was not a bitter smile. It was the smile of a man who had just understood something important about the people sitting across from him. Lydia's expression flickered, just for a moment, just a fraction of a second, but I saw it. They expected tears. They expected rage. Instead, I smiled, and I saw something I had never seen before in Lydia's eyes: fear. I did not sign the papers that night. I told them I needed time to review the documents properly, that a decision of this magnitude deserved careful consideration. Lydia's smile tightened at the edges, but she nodded and said, "Of course, take a few days, we understand." Thomas looked annoyed. Evan looked relieved, though I was not sure why. I drove home in silence, my mind turning over possibilities I could not yet name, and I spent the next 2 days sitting in my study staring at the folder without opening it again. On the morning of the third day, my phone rang. The name on the screen was Daniel Brooks. Daniel was an old friend, a quiet lawyer who had known Margaret and me for over 30 years. He had handled her estate after she passed, managed the legal details I was too grief-stricken to face myself. We had not spoken much since then, just the occasional holiday card and a brief call on the anniversary of her death. So when his voice came through the phone that morning, tight with something I could not identify, I knew immediately that this was not a social call. "Richard, I need to see you," he said. "Today, if possible. There is something Margaret left with me, something she gave me specific instructions about." He paused, and I heard him take a breath. "She told me I was only to give it to you if Evan ever betrayed you." I do not remember the drive to his office. I must have made it because I found myself sitting across from Daniel's desk an hour later, but the roads between my house and his building had vanished from my memory entirely. My hands were trembling. I didn't know whether to feel hope or heartbreak, whether Margaret's foresight was a blessing or a confirmation that she had seen the end coming long before I did. Daniel reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a cream-colored envelope. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. My name written in Margaret's careful script, the same script I had seen on grocery lists and birthday cards and love notes left on my pillow during 40 years of marriage. I took the envelope from him and held it for a long moment, feeling the weight of the paper, the weight of everything it represented. Inside was a single page folded twice. "Richard." It began, "If you're reading this, what I feared has happened. I prayed I was wrong. I prayed that the woman our son married was simply ambitious and not calculating, that her family was simply proud and not predatory. But I watched her, my love. I watched how she looked at our company, not with appreciation, not with gratitude, but with hunger. I watched our son change under her influence, becoming someone I barely recognized, and I knew that if I did nothing, everything we built together would be taken from you the moment I was gone." I had to stop reading. The tears came suddenly, silently blurring the words on the page. I wiped my eyes and continued. "Daniel has everything you need. I modified our living trust 2 years before I died, adding a clause that protects you. If operational control of the company is ever transferred through coercion or without proper dual consent from both founders or the surviving founder, Daniel has the authority to freeze all assets and petition the court for a full review. They cannot take what is yours without a fight. I made sure of it." The letter continued for another paragraph, but one line burned itself into my memory forever. "Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used. Fight back, my love, not with anger, but with truth." Daniel waited until I finished reading before he spoke. "She came to me 3 years before she passed," he said quietly. "She had been documenting the Whitmore family's behavior for months. Small things at first, comments they made, patterns she noticed. She never told you because she did not want to hurt you or damage your relationship with Evan. But she saw what was coming, Richard. She saw it before any of us." He slid a second folder across the desk. Inside were pages of notes in Margaret's handwriting, dates and observations and questions she had never asked aloud. She had watched Lydia's family with the same careful attention she once gave to balance sheets and client relationships. She had seen the cracks in their facade, the desperation beneath the expensive clothes and loud boasts, and she had prepared quietly and thoroughly to protect me from the storm she knew would come. I sat in Daniel's office for a long time after that, holding her letter, reading her words again and again. My wife had been dead for 3 years, but somehow she was still saving me. 1 week later, I returned to the Whitmore home and signed the papers. I had spent those 7 days with Daniel reviewing every document Margaret had prepared, understanding the full scope of what she had built to protect me. The living trust clause was ironclad. The moment they violated its terms, Daniel could freeze everything and drag them into court. But timing mattered. Margaret had written that in her notes. "Do not strike too early, Hassan," she had warned. "Let them reveal themselves fully. The truth is most powerful when it is undeniable." So I played a role. I sat at the same dining table where they had ambushed me, and I let my hand tremble as I picked up the pen. I let my voice crack when I said I hoped they would take care of what Margaret and I had built. I looked at Evan with eyes I made sure seemed broken, defeated, and I watched something flicker across his face that might have been guilt or might have been doubt. Lydia's smile was radiant with triumph. Thomas clapped Evan on the back and called him a smart businessman. Janice was already talking about restructuring, using the word "we," as if the company had always belonged to her family. I signed every page they put in front of me, and when it was done, I stood up slowly like a man who had just surrendered the last thing he had left to live for. I said nothing else. I simply walked out the door and let them believe they had won. The months that followed were difficult to watch, but I watched anyway. From a distance, through contacts who still trusted me through public records and industry news, I observed Lydia take the wheel of everything Margaret and I had spent 40 years building. She moved fast. I will give her that. Within the first month, she had rebranded the company with a new logo and marketing strategy that she called Modern and Fresh. Our loyal customers, many of whom had been with us for decades, called it confusing and impersonal. 2 of them reached out to me directly asking what had happened. I told them I had retired and wished the new leadership well. I didn't tell them what I was really doing. By the 3rd month, Lydia had launched an aggressive expansion into markets we had never operated in before. She called it growth strategy. Anyone with experience would have called it overreach. She hired consultants with impressive degrees and no understanding of our industry. She terminated longtime employees who questioned her decisions, calling them resistant to change and stuck in the past. 3 senior managers, people who had been with us for 15 years or more, resigned within 4 months. They sent me letters. They apologized as if they had failed me. I wrote back to each one and told them they had done nothing wrong. I kept a notebook during those months. Dates, decisions, consequences. Every choice Lydia made, every client who left, every asset she sold. I documented it all with the same precision Margaret had once applied to our financial records. I was not watching my company die. I was building a case. By the 7th month, the cracks were impossible to ignore. Revenue had dropped 23%. 2 bank loans were flagged for review because the company's debt-to-income ratio had changed so dramatically. The industry publications that had once praised our stability began running stories about troubled leadership and uncertain futures. Lydia blamed market conditions in public statements. Thomas, in private conversations that made their way back to me, blamed the previous leadership, meaning me. But the numbers did not lie. The numbers never lie. Margaret taught me that. What caught my attention most was something quieter, something that did not make the news. Lydia had begun selling company assets, equipment, and property that had taken us years to acquire, and she was selling them below market value, significantly below. She called it strategic liquidation, freeing up capital for new investments. But I recognized the pattern. I had seen it before in struggling companies and businesses that were bleeding cash and needed to stop the wound at any cost. Lydia was not restructuring. She was desperate, and desperation always leaves fingerprints. I shared everything with Daniel. He reviewed my notes, cross-referenced them with public filings, and confirmed what I already suspected. The Whitmores were not simply greedy, they were drowning. And they had used my son, my company, my life's work as a life raft. The question now was how long they could keep their heads above water before the weight of their own decisions pulled them under. They thought they were building an empire on my ruins. They did not realize they were standing on quicksand, and I was the one who knew where it ended. Daniel called me on a Tuesday morning 8 months after I had signed away my company. His voice was different than usual, quieter, more careful, as if he was handling something fragile that might break if he spoke too loudly. He asked me to come to his office immediately. He said he had found something about the Whitmore family that I needed to see in person. He said it would change everything I thought I understood. I arrived within the hour. Daniel was waiting for me with a thick folder spread across his desk. Pages covered in financial records, court documents, and corporate filings I did not recognize. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from discovering something you wish you had not found. He gestured for me to sit, poured me a glass of water I did not ask for, and then he began to explain what his investigation had uncovered. Thomas Whitmore's investment firm had collapsed 8 years ago. Not struggled, not downsized, collapsed entirely, destroyed by bad bets on real estate developments that never materialized, and debts that multiplied faster than any legitimate business could sustain. Thomas had hidden the damage through a web of shell companies and creative accounting, moving money between accounts to create the illusion of solvency while the foundation crumbled beneath him. By the time the final cards fell, he owed more than $2 million to creditors who were still, according to Daniel's research, actively pursuing repayment. The yacht Thomas had boasted about at that dinner, the 40-foot vessel with custom upholstery and premium navigation systems, was leased. He did not own it. He rented it for weekend appearances, paying monthly fees. He could barely afford to maintain an image of success that had no basis in reality. The European vacation he and Janice had described in such loving detail, 3 weeks in Italy and France with first-class flights and 5-star hotels, had been charged entirely to credit cards that were now maxed to their limits. The family home, that pristine 2-acre monument to wealth and status, had been second mortgaged twice. The Whitmores were not the prosperous in-laws they pretended to be. They were drowning, and they had been drowning for years. Daniel laid out the timeline with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. 8 years ago, the firm collapsed. 7 years ago, Thomas began orchestrating introductions between Lydia and eligible young men from wealthy families. 6 years ago, Lydia met Evan at a charity event that Thomas had specifically arranged to attend because he knew my son would be there. Every dinner, every compliment, every carefully planned encounter that followed was not courtship. It was strategy. Lydia was the family's most valuable asset, educated and articulate, charming and calculating, capable of securing a future that her father's failures had destroyed. She had targeted Evan specifically because of me, because of the company Margaret and I had built, because the Whitmores needed a life raft and my family looked like salvation. "They did not marry into your family," Daniel said, quietly sliding a document toward me that showed the timeline of Thomas's debts alongside the timeline of Lydia's relationship with my son. "They infiltrated it." I sat in silence for a long time after he finished speaking. The revelation hurt more than I expected, not because of the money, not because of the company, but because of what it meant for Evan. My son believed his marriage was real. He believed Lydia loved him, that their life together was built on something genuine. He didn't know that he had been selected like an investment, courted like a business opportunity, married for the access he could provide to resources his wife's family desperately needed. Whatever children they might have, whatever future they were building, was founded on a lie so complete that Evan might never recover from learning the truth. But alongside the hurt, there was clarity. I finally understood exactly what I was fighting. Lydia was not simply greedy or ambitious. She was desperate, backed into a corner by circumstances her family had created long before she ever met my son. Desperate people are dangerous because they have nothing left to lose, but they are also predictable. They make mistakes, they overreach, they move too fast and grab too hard because they cannot afford the patience that careful planning requires. That was why Lydia had pushed so aggressively at that dinner. That was why she was selling company assets below market value. She did not have the luxury of time. Her family's creditors were circling, and every month that passed without significant cash flow brought them closer to complete exposure. I gathered Daniel's documents and placed them carefully in my briefcase. I thanked him for his work and told him we would need to move soon. He nodded and asked if I was ready for what came next. I told him I had been ready since the moment I read Margaret's letter. Lydia didn't marry my son for love. She married him for survival. And now I understood this was not greed. This was war. The night after Daniel revealed the truth about the Whitmores, I could not sleep. I sat in the small apartment I had rented after signing away my home along with my company, a modest place with 2 rooms and a kitchen that still smelled faintly of the previous tenant's cooking. Margaret would have hated it. She always said a home should have space to breathe, room for memories to settle into the walls. But that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, I realized this cramped apartment was about to become something she would have understood perfectly. It was about to become a war room. Daniel arrived the next morning with 2 boxes of documents and a laptop he set up on my dining table. Within hours, every surface was covered with papers, the modified trust Margaret had created. bank statements tracking the company's declining finances, corporate records showing every decision Lydia had made since taking control, a timeline of violations that grew longer with each page we reviewed. Daniel organized everything with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 30 years building cases that held up under scrutiny. He explained that we needed 3 pillars to support our legal challenge, and we would not move forward until each one was unshakable. The first pillar was the trust violation itself. Margaret's clause was specific. Operational control of the company could not be transferred without proper dual consent from both founders or from the surviving founder if one had passed. The papers I signed at the Whitmore dinner did not meet that standard. I had been pressured, ambushed, presented with documents I had no time to review in an environment designed to intimidate. Daniel had already identified 2 witnesses who could testify to the coercive nature of that evening, former employees who had heard rumors about what happened and reached out to me quietly in the months since. The second pillar was breach of fiduciary duty. Lydia was legally obligated to act in the company's best interest, not her own and certainly not her family's. The pattern of asset liquidation I had documented, selling equipment and property below market value to generate quick cash, was evidence of mismanagement at best and deliberate self-dealing at worst. Daniel suspected the money was flowing somewhere specific, and we needed to prove it. The third pillar came together when I began reaching out to former employees, the ones Lydia had dismissed for being resistant to change, the ones who had resigned rather than work under her leadership. I called them one by one carefully without revealing the full scope of what I was planning. Their stories were remarkably consistent. Lydia had ignored their expertise, demanded loyalty she had not earned, created a culture of fear where disagreement was treated as insubordination. 3 of them agreed to provide written statements documenting what they had witnessed. 2 revealed they had kept personal records of questionable financial decisions, concerned even then that something improper was happening, but it was the former accountant who gave us what we needed most. Her name was Patricia, and she had worked for the company for 12 years before Lydia terminated her for asking too many questions about a new expense category that had appeared in the books. She told me about irregularities. She had noticed large sums being transferred monthly to consulting fees paid to an outside firm. The payments had started 3 months after Lydia took control and increased steadily ever since. Patricia had saved copies of the invoices before she was escorted from the building. The firm's name was Whitmore Advisory Group. Daniel nearly dropped his coffee when I told him. Whitmore Advisory Group was the shell company Thomas had created years ago, the same entity he had used to hide debts and shuffle money during his investment firm's collapse. Lydia was funneling company funds directly to her family, using my life's work to pay off her father's creditors and maintain their illusion of wealth. It was not just mismanagement, it was theft. We worked for 3 more weeks organizing evidence, preparing affidavits, building a case so comprehensive that no judge could dismiss it. When Daniel was satisfied that we were ready, he filed preliminary paperwork with the Harris County Probate Court. It was not a full lawsuit, not yet. It was a request for a review of trust compliance, a formal notice that irregularities had been identified and needed investigation. The filing would put Lydia on notice that someone was watching, but it would not reveal how much we actually knew. More importantly, it started a legal clock. From the moment that paperwork was processed, any further asset transfers could be challenged as bad faith actions designed to hide evidence or deplete resources before judgment. "We are not attacking yet," Daniel explained as we reviewed the final documents. "We are positioning. When we strike, they will not have time to hide anything. They will not have time to prepare a defense. The law favors those who are ready, Richard. And we are ready." I looked around my small apartment at the stacks of evidence covering every surface at the timeline pinned to the wall, showing 8 months of documented failures and fraudulent transfers. They thought I was a defeated old man licking his wounds in some forgotten corner of the city. They didn't know I was building an army, and the clock had started ticking. The clock I had started did not tick quietly. Within weeks of Daniel filing the preliminary paperwork, the consequences began rippling through everything Lydia had tried to build on my company's foundation. I watched from a distance, through contacts who still kept me informed as the walls began closing in around her. The first blow came from Morrison Industrial, our largest client, a contract I had personally cultivated over 15 years of careful relationship building. Their CEO, a man named Walter Morrison, who had attended Margaret's funeral and wept openly at her graveside, sent a formal letter terminating their agreement. The language was polite but unmistakable. They cited a lack of confidence in current leadership and concerns about the company's financial stability. Lydia called him personally, I was told, trying to salvage the relationship with promises of restructuring and renewed commitment to quality. Walter listened politely and then said no. He told her that business relationships were built on trust, and trust once broken could not be repaired with PowerPoint presentations and mission statements. Morrison Industrial had been worth nearly 30% of annual revenue. Their departure was not just a loss, it was a signal to everyone else that the ship was sinking. Two banks froze credit lines within days of each other, both citing the need for additional review of the company's financial position. A major supplier, one we had worked with since the early years, demanded advance payment on all future orders instead of the usual 30-day terms. They had heard rumors, they said. They needed to protect themselves. Lydia held emergency meetings with her remaining staff, the consultants she had hired, and the loyalists she had promoted. But her MBA theories could not fix relationships she had burned through arrogance and neglect. She blamed sabotage. She blamed market conditions. She blamed the previous leadership, meaning me, for leaving her with a company that was weaker than it appeared. She never once considered that the saboteur was her own reflection in the mirror. The pressure from her family made everything worse. Thomas and Janice began calling daily, sometimes multiple times, demanding updates and reassurance. Their creditors had grown more aggressive since the consulting fees from Whitmore Advisory Group had slowed to a trickle. There simply was not enough cash flow anymore to maintain the payments that had been keeping their debts at bay. One of my contacts, an employee who still worked in the building and remembered what Margaret had meant to them, overheard a phone call between Lydia and her father that painted a picture more desperate than anything I had imagined. Thomas was shouting so loudly that his voice carried through Lydia's closed office door. "You promised this would save us," he screamed. "You promised we would be safe by now. What are we supposed to tell the bank? What are we supposed to tell the lawyers?" And Lydia's voice, usually so controlled, so precise, cracked as she responded, "I'm trying, Daddy, I'm trying." The woman who had orchestrated my removal with such cold confidence was falling apart under the weight of expectations she could never have met. But it was Evan who worried me most. My son had grown quieter in the months since the takeover, withdrawing from the confident executive role Lydia had promised him into something smaller and more uncertain. He stopped attending her strategy meetings. He delegated responsibilities he had once insisted on handling personally. Former colleagues told me he spent long hours alone in his office with the door closed, and when he emerged, his eyes had the hollow look of someone who had not slept in days. I saw him once during that period purely by accident. I had driven past this company building on my way to meet Daniel, a route I usually avoided, but took that day because of road construction. Evan's car was parked in the far corner of the lot away from the other vehicles, and he was sitting inside it, not moving, not making a call, just sitting there staring at his phone with an expression I could not read from that distance. He stayed there for 20 minutes. I know because I pulled over and watched, unable to look away from my son's private moment of what might have been despair or might have been something else entirely. When he finally got out of the car and walked toward the building, his shoulders were hunched, his steps slow, and his hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the door. I learned later that his hands trembled now whenever he signed documents. The confident signature that had once matched his father's in boldness had become hesitant, uncertain, the penmanship of a man who no longer believed in what he was putting his name to. Something inside my son was breaking. I could see it from a distance, could feel it in the reports that reached me through channels Lydia did not know existed, but I could not tell which way the pieces would fall when the final fracture came. For the first time, my son looked afraid, but I could not tell what frightened him more. Failing Lydia or becoming her. I could not stop thinking about my son sitting alone in that parking lot, staring at his phone with trembling hands. The image haunted me through sleepless nights and quiet mornings until I realized that watching from a distance was no longer enough. Whatever was happening inside Evan, whatever battle he was fighting with himself, I needed to understand it. Not for the case, not for the company. For the simple reason that he was still my son, and somewhere beneath the choices he had made, there might still be something worth reaching. I sent him a text message, the first direct communication between us in nearly a year. I asked him to meet me at a coffee shop on the edge of town, a small place with wooden tables and the smell of fresh pastries that reminded me of simpler times. We used to go there when he was young, back when Saturday mornings meant pancakes and conversations about everything and nothing. I chose it deliberately, hoping the memory might soften whatever walls he had built. He responded with a single word, "Okay." Evan arrived 20 minutes late, and the man who walked through the door barely resembled the confident executive who had told me I was old and needed to step aside. His suit was wrinkled. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, the eyes of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. He had lost weight, his cheeks sharper than I remembered, his shoulders carrying a tension that seemed to have settled permanently into his bones. He sat down across from me without ordering anything, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Finally, I said the only thing I had come to say. "I'm not here to fight Evan. I'm not here to accuse you or blame you or make you feel worse than you already do. I'm here to understand. Help me understand, son." The dam broke slowly at first, then all at once. Evan started speaking in fragment sentences that tumbled over each other as if they had been trapped inside him for years and were finally finding their way out. He talked about growing up in my shadow, about feeling invisible no matter how hard he worked or how much he achieved. He talked about Margaret's death, how losing her had left him unmoored in ways he still could not fully articulate. She had been the bridge between us, he said. Without her, he didn't know how to reach me anymore. And then he talked about Lydia. "She saw me, Dad. Not as your son. Not as the heir to something you built. She saw me, as someone who mattered on my own terms. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was enough." His voice cracked on the last word, and he looked down at his hands clasped tightly on the table between us. But somewhere along the way, being seen became being controlled. She made every decision feel like it was mine, but looking back, I can see how she guided everything. By the time I realized the difference, I was in too deep. I had signed papers, made promises, cut ties with people who tried to warn me. I knew what she was doing was wrong. I knew it, Dad. But I did not know how to stop without losing everything. Her, the life we built, my own sense of who I had become. I listened without interruption. I let him speak until the words ran out, and he sat there, empty, waiting for judgment that would confirm everything he already believed about himself. But judgment was not what I had come to deliver. "I failed you too," I said quietly. Evan looked up, surprise flickering across his exhausted face. "After your mother died, I buried myself in work instead of grief. I thought if I kept moving, the pain would not catch me. But all I did was leave you alone with yours. I handed you responsibility without guidance, legacy without wisdom. I thought giving you the company was love, Evan. I thought preparing your inheritance was the same as preparing you. But love requires presence, not just provision, and I was not present, not when it mattered." The coffee shop was quiet around us, the morning rush long past the afternoon crowd not yet arrived. We sat in that silence together, two men who had hurt each other in ways that might never fully heal, finally seeing each other clearly for the first time in years. It was not forgiveness. Neither of us was ready for that, and forgiveness given too easily means nothing anyway. But it was honesty. It was a beginning. Then Evan said something that made my heart stop. He looked at me with tears in his eyes, his voice barely above a whisper, and said, "There are things I have not told you, Dad, things that might change everything." I waited, afraid to breathe, afraid to break whatever fragile courage had brought him to this moment. "I've been keeping a secret," he said, "and it is time you knew what it is." Evan reached into his jacket pocket with a hand that trembled visibly, and he placed a small black USB drive on the table between us. It was barely larger than my thumb, an insignificant piece of plastic that looked like it could hold nothing more important than a few photographs or a forgotten document. But the way Evan looked at it, the way his eyes fixed on that tiny object as if it contained something that might save him or destroy him, told me this was no ordinary collection of files. "I started recording 6 months ago," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every meeting between Lydia and her father, every phone call I could capture when they thought I was not listening, every plan they made when they believed I was too weak or too controlled to notice what was really happening." He paused, swallowing hard, his Adam's apple bobbing with the effort. "I have hours of conversations on that drive, Dad. Hours. I stared at the USB as if it might explode. 6 months. My son had been secretly documenting his wife's conspiracy for half a year, moving through his days as the compliant husband while building something in the shadows that none of them suspected. I did not know whether to feel hope or horror. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you do this?" Evan's voice cracked on the answer. "Because I needed proof. Not for you, Dad. Not for any legal case or courtroom strategy. I needed proof for myself." He finally looked up, meeting my eyes with an expression so raw that I had to fight the urge to look away. I needed to know I was not the monster, that somewhere inside me, underneath all the things I let happen, and all the papers I signed, and all the times I stayed silent when I should have spoken, there was still a part of me that knew right from wrong. Recording them was the only way I could prove to myself that I had not completely disappeared into who they wanted me to be. I took the USB drive and held it in my palm, feeling its negligible weight, understanding that what it contained might change everything. That evening, I brought it to Daniel. He connected it to a secure laptop in his office, and we spent the next 4 hours listening to conversations that painted a picture more damning than anything we had assembled on our own. Thomas Whitmore's voice filled the room, first coaching Lydia on strategy with the confidence of a general directing a campaign. He explained how to isolate me from the remaining board members who might still hold loyalty. He outlined talking points designed to make my retirement seem like my own idea language that would protect them legally while stripping me of everything I had built. He laughed at one point about how easy it had been, how an old man's love for his son had been the perfect weakness to exploit. "Sentiment is leverage," he said on the recording. "Richard Hale built a company on relationships, and that is exactly why he was never going to see this coming." Lydia's voice was worse, cold and calculating in ways that the polished woman I had met at family dinners had always hidden beneath pleasant smiles. She discussed how to manage what she called Evan's occasional guilt strategies for making him feel included enough to stay compliant without giving him any real power. "He needs to believe he matters," she told her father in one recording. "The moment he feels useless, he will start asking questions we do not want to answer. Keep him busy with small decisions. Let him think he is contributing." There were discussions about liquidating the company entirely once they had extracted enough value to clear the Whitmore debts and establish themselves elsewhere. They talked about selling the client list to competitors, about stripping the pension fund, about converting physical assets to cash that could be moved before anyone noticed the pattern. They joked about me calling me the old man who had been too trusting to see what was right in front of him, too sentimental to protect what his wife had helped him build. But the recording that made Daniel stop the playback and look at me with something close to shock came from a conversation dated just 3 weeks before our coffee shop meeting. Lydia's voice was tense, frustrated, responding to something her father had said about timelines. "Evan is getting soft," she said clearly. "He has been distant lately, asking questions about where the money is going, why we are selling assets so quickly. I think he might be losing his nerve." There was a pause, then Thomas's reply. "Then we might need to cut him out too when this is done. He served his purpose. We do not need him anymore." The silence in Daniel's office after that recording ended was absolute. My son's wife, the woman he had believed loved him, had spoken about discarding him like a tool that had outlived its usefulness. Whatever Evan had done, whatever weakness had allowed him to be manipulated into betraying his own father, Lydia had never seen him as anything more than a means to an end. Daniel began the process of authenticating the recordings, confirming their integrity, and preparing them for legal use. Texas was a one-party consent state, he reminded me, meaning that because Evan had been present during these conversations, his recordings were admissible in court. We had not just evidence now, we had confessions. I sat in silence after Daniel finished his assessment, turning everything over in my mind. My son was not innocent. He had participated in the betrayal, enabled it through weakness, signed the papers that transferred control of everything Margaret and I had built. But he was not completely lost either. Somewhere in the wreckage of the man he had become, Evan had held on to enough conscience to build an exit to create a record of truth that could not be denied or explained away. It was not heroism. It was survival. And survival, I knew from my own decades of building something from nothing, was sometimes the first step towards something better. "This does not fix what you did," I said finally when I called Evan later that night to tell him Daniel had confirmed the recordings were authentic. "I know," he replied quietly. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Dad. I know I have not earned that. I am asking for a chance to earn it, someday, if I can." My son had betrayed me, but he had also been building a weapon against the woman who controlled him, and now that weapon was in my hands. Daniel worked through the night preparing the final petition. By morning, he had assembled a document that read like an indictment, every page building upon the last until the weight of evidence became undeniable. He filed it with the Harris County Probate Court on a Thursday morning, walking the papers through the clerk's office himself to ensure nothing was delayed or misfiled. The petition alleged violation of trust provisions, breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent transfer of company assets, and evidence of a coordinated scheme to defraud. Attached as exhibits were the written statements from former employees, the financial records tracing payments to Whitmore Advisory Group, and selected recordings from Evan's USB drive that demonstrated not just wrongdoing, but deliberate intent. The court's response came faster than even Daniel had anticipated. By Friday afternoon, a judge had reviewed the emergency motion and granted a temporary restraining order, freezing all company assets and operations pending a full evidentiary review. No further financial transactions could be processed. No assets could be transferred or sold. No operational decisions of any significance could be made without explicit court approval. The company Margaret and I had built over 40 years was now under judicial protection, locked away from the people who had tried to steal it. I insisted on being present when the court officer delivered the papers. Daniel advised against it, warning that my presence might be seen as provocative, but I needed to see this moment with my own eyes. I needed to watch the empire of lies collapse in real time. So I stood in the lobby of my own company building a visitor, now in the place where I had once made every decision that mattered, and I waited for justice to announce itself. Lydia was in the middle of a board meeting when the interruption came. I learned the details later from witnesses who were present employees who remembered me and understood what was happening even before Lydia did. The conference room doors opened without a knock, and a court officer entered with papers in hand, asking for Lydia Hale by name. She stood up from the head of the table, confusion flickering across her face, and accepted the documents with the automatic politeness of someone who had not yet realized their world was ending. The color drained from her face as she read. Her hands began to shake slightly at first, then visibly enough that the board members around the table exchanged uneasy glances. Thomas Whitmore was there, of course, seated in a chair along the wall in his unofficial capacity as consultant. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and grabbed the papers from his daughter's trembling fingers, scanning the legal language with eyes that grew wider with every paragraph. "This is harassment," he shouted loud enough to be heard in the hallway where I stood listening. "This is a frivolous lawsuit from a bitter old man who cannot accept that his time is over. We will fight this. We will sue them for malicious prosecution. They cannot do this to us." But the temporary restraining order was clear. The court had done exactly this, and all of Thomas's bluster could not change the reality printed on those pages. Within minutes, the meeting dissolved into chaos. Board members demanded to know what was happening, what the allegations meant, why a judge had found sufficient cause to freeze an entire company's operations. Lydia tried to maintain control, tried to project the calm authority she had always worn so well. But her voice wavered, and her explanations contradicted themselves, and everyone in that room could see that the woman who had positioned herself as the company's savior was watching her carefully constructed world fall apart. News traveled through the building within hours and through the industry within days. By Monday morning, the remaining clients were calling with questions that sounded more like accusations. They wanted to know if the allegations were true, if their contracts were safe, if they should be looking for alternative providers. Board members who had stayed quiet during Lydia's tenure, too intimidated or too complicit to challenge her decisions, suddenly found their voices and their concerns. Emergency meetings were called, lawyers were consulted, the atmosphere shifted from uncertainty to panic. The Whitmore's own creditors began calling, too suddenly aware that the bailout they had been promised was frozen behind a wall of judicial oversight. Thomas had been stringing them along for months with assurances that funds would be available soon, that his daughter's new position would generate the cash flow needed to clear his debts once and for all. Now those creditors wanted answers he could not provide, and their patience had run out entirely. But the detail that I learned about only later, the moment that captured everything about how completely Lydia's control had collapsed, happened in the quiet aftermath of that chaotic Monday. Lydia walked to Evan's office, perhaps seeking an ally, perhaps needing someone to blame, perhaps simply looking for the husband she believed she still controlled. The door was unlocked. The room was empty. His desk had been cleared of personal items. His computer showed nothing but a factory reset screen. The drawers contained only office supplies and blank paper. My son had vanished, leaving no note, no explanation, nothing but absence where his presence had once been. Lydia called his phone. It rang once and went to voicemail. She called again. Same result. She called 17 times over the next 2 hours. I was told each call shorter than the last, as panic replaced confusion, and confusion gave way to something that might have been the first genuine emotion she had shown in years. Evan never answered. He never called back. The man she had manipulated and managed and dismissed as getting soft had simply walked away without giving her the courtesy of a goodbye. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I didn't need to. Margaret had taught me long ago that the loudest voice in the room rarely wins the lasting victory. The law spoke for me now, and it spoke in a language that Lydia's MBA had never prepared her to answer. Every document Daniel had filed, every exhibit attached to our petition, every recording that captured her own words in her own voice was now part of a public record that no amount of charm or confidence could erase. Lydia stared at the empty office where her husband used to sit, phone pressed to her ear, listening to a voicemail that would never be returned. For the first time, she was completely alone. The court documents became public record on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, the story had spread through every corner of the business community that had once respected the Whitmore name. A local journalist named Sarah Chen, who had covered the company for years and had written a glowing profile of Margaret after her passing, obtained copies of the filings and began making calls. By Thursday, her exposé appeared on the front page of the business section under a headline that left nothing to interpretation: Family Company Founder Fights Back Against Alleged Takeover Scheme. The article was thorough in ways that made denial impossible. Sarah had traced the Whitmore family's financial collapse through public bankruptcy records and court filings from years past. She documented the creation of Whitmore Advisory Group, the shell company that had received hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees from a business that had no legitimate need for Thomas Whitmore's expertise. She outlined the pattern of asset liquidation, the below-market sales that had converted company property into cash that flowed directly to creditors the Whitmores had been hiding from for nearly a decade. And she quoted extensively from the court filings, including transcripts of recordings where Lydia discussed managing her husband's guilt, and Thomas joked about the old man finally being out of the way. The reaction was immediate and merciless. Thomas Whitmore had spent years cultivating an image of success among business associates, golf partners, and fellow members of organizations that valued wealth and influence above all else. He had bragged about investments, dropped hints about connections, presented himself as a man whose advice was worth seeking and whose approval was worth earning. Now, those same people read every word of Sarah's article and recognized the con for what it had always been. The yacht was leased. The European vacations were financed by maxed credit cards. The consulting firm was a vehicle for fraud. Thomas received no phone calls of support. He received only silence, which in his world was the loudest form of condemnation. Janice suffered in different ways. The country club she had worked so hard to belong to, the one where she had worn her cubic zirconia diamonds and pretended they were real, became a place she could no longer enter without feeling every eye in the room turn toward her with judgment. She stopped attending luncheons. She stopped showing up for tennis matches. She retreated into the house that was mortgaged twice over and waited for the storm to pass, not understanding that some storms do not pass. They simply reveal what was always underneath. Lydia tried to control the narrative. She released a carefully worded statement through a public relations firm, describing the situation as a family dispute that had been exaggerated by legal maneuvering. She called it a misunderstanding that would be resolved through proper channels. She expressed hope that privacy would be respected during this difficult time. But the recordings made her own words undeniable. Local news stations obtained clips from the court filings, and suddenly Lydia's voice filled living rooms across the city, calm and calculating, saying things that no public relations strategy could explain away. "The old man will be out of the way soon," she had told her father in one recording. "Evan is getting soft. We might need to cut him out too when this is done." Her polished image shattered against the reality of what she had actually said when she believed no one was listening. The professional consequences followed swiftly. Lydia's MBA network, the alumni associations and business groups that had once celebrated her as an example of female leadership in corporate environments, began quietly distancing themselves. References to her accomplishments disappeared from newsletters and websites. A speaking engagement at a women's business conference where she had been scheduled to discuss breaking barriers in family-owned enterprises was postponed indefinitely. No one called to explain. No one offered sympathy. Her name simply vanished from programs and agendas, erased as if she had never been celebrated at all. The family that had presented such a united front over dinner tables and holiday photographs fractured under the weight of consequences none of them had prepared for. Thomas suffered a health scare 2 weeks after the article appeared, chest pains that sent him to the emergency room and kept him hospitalized for 3 days while doctors ran tests and warned about stress levels. Janice blamed Lydia for bringing destruction upon them all. Lydia blamed Evan for disappearing when she needed him most, for abandoning her to face the fallout alone after everything she had done to build their future together. The Whitmores had always functioned as a unit, their individual weaknesses hidden behind collective ambition. Now, with nothing left to gain from unity, they turned on each other with the same ruthlessness they had once directed outward. And through all of it, one question remained unanswered. Where was Evan? Lydia had tried calling him dozens of times since discovering his empty office. She had sent messages that ranged from pleading to threatening to desperate. She had contacted his friends, his former colleagues, anyone who might know where her husband had gone. No one had answers. No one had seen him. It was as if Evan had simply ceased to exist the moment he walked out of the building that day. Then, 3 weeks after the court filing, Lydia finally received a response. A single text message from his number appeared on her phone. "Don't look for me. I'm finding out who I am without you." She stared at those words for a long time, I was told later, reading them over and over as if they might change meaning. Then she threw her phone across the room, hard enough to crack the screen against the wall. I did not celebrate any of this. I didn't gloat or make public statements or give interviews to journalists who wanted my side of the story. I had spent decades building something with Margaret, and watching it nearly destroyed by people who saw it only as a resource to exploit brought no joy, even now that justice was being served. The Whitmores were not evil in the way that stories often portray villains. They were desperate, drowning, grasping at anything that might save them from consequences they had earned through their own choices. I understood desperation. I had faced it myself in the early years when Margaret mortgaged our home without telling me because she believed in our future more than she feared our present. The difference was that Margaret had built something the Whitmores had only ever taken. Then on a quiet Sunday morning, my doorbell rang. I was not expecting anyone. Daniel and I had paused our legal preparations for the weekend, waiting for the court to schedule the next hearing. I set down my coffee and walked to the door, opening it to find Lydia standing alone in the rain. Her hair was wet, plastered to her face. Her mascara had run in dark streaks down her cheeks. She looked nothing like the polished, confident woman who had slid a folder across a dinner table and told me it was time to retire. She looked broken in ways I had not imagined possible. "Please help me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 words. That was all she could manage before the tears came. I stepped back from the doorway and let her in. I do not know why. Perhaps it was the rain, cold and relentless, soaking through her expensive coat. Perhaps it was the memory of Margaret, who had always believed that even enemies deserved shelter from storms. Or perhaps I simply needed to hear what she had come to say to understand what desperation truly looked like when it had nowhere left to hide. Lydia sat on the edge of my couch, dripping water onto cushions she probably would have criticized as outdated under different circumstances. She did not look around the small apartment. She did not comment on how far I had fallen from the home I once shared with my wife. She simply sat there, hands clasped in her lap, and began to speak in a voice stripped of every pretense I had ever heard her wear. "I know what I did was wrong," she said. The words came out flat, rehearsed perhaps, but there was something underneath them that sounded almost genuine. "I know you have every reason to hate me, every reason to want me destroyed, but I'm asking you, begging you to consider a settlement. Drop the charges. Let me walk away with something. Anything." She looked up at me, mascara still streaking her cheeks, and for the first time I saw not the calculating woman who had orchestrated my removal, but someone younger. Someone frightened, someone who had built her entire identity on a foundation that was crumbling beneath her feet. My family was drowning, Richard. We had been drowning for years. I did what I thought I had to do to save them, to save myself. I know that does not make it right, but I'm asking you to understand. I stood by the window watching the rain fall, and I felt something I had not anticipated. Not satisfaction, not triumph. Sadness, deep and heavy, settling into my chest like a weight I had not asked to carry. Lydia's desperation explained her actions. It contextualized the choices she had made, the lies she had told the family she had tried to steal. But it did not excuse them. Understanding why someone does harm does not erase the harm itself. Margaret had taught me that. Compassion and accountability are not opposites, they are partners, and one without the other leads only to more damage. I was about to respond to tell her that settlements were for Daniel to discuss, and that I could promise nothing when the sound of a car pulling into the driveway stopped me. Lydia heard it too. She turned toward the window, her expression shifting from despair to confusion, and then to something that looked almost like hope. Evan stepped out of the car. He was thinner than the last time I had seen him, his face sharper, his movements slower. But there was something different about him too, something I could not immediately name. He walked toward the front door with a steadiness that had been absent from him for years, a quiet certainty in his steps that I had not seen since before his wedding. Lydia was on her feet before he reached the porch. "Evan," she breathed, and for a moment her voice held the warmth of a wife greeting her husband. "You came back. I knew you would not abandon me. I knew you would come when I needed you most." Evan opened the door and stepped inside. He looked at Lydia for one long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he walked past her without a word. He crossed the room to where I stood by the window and stopped in front of me close enough that I could see the exhaustion in his eyes and something else beneath it. Resolution. "I didn't come for her," he said quietly. "I came for you." From inside his jacket, he produced a manila envelope thick with documents and held it out to me. I took it, opened it, and found myself looking at papers I had not expected to see. The first was a divorce filing already signed by Evan, waiting only for Lydia's signature to become final. The second was a legal document I had to read twice before I understood what it meant: Evan's voluntary renunciation of all claims to the company and to the family trust Margaret and I had established. He was giving up everything: the inheritance, the position, the future that had been promised to him since childhood. "I do not deserve it," Evan said, his voice steady even as his eyes glistened. "I do not deserve a company I helped betray. I do not deserve a position I did nothing to earn. I do not deserve the legacy Mom built because I let someone else try to destroy it." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Dad. I know I have not earned that. Maybe I never will. But I'm asking for a chance to start over, from the bottom, as someone who builds something of his own instead of inheriting what others built for him." Behind him, Lydia's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "What are you doing? What is this?" She grabbed his arm, trying to turn him toward her. "Evan, we can fix this. We can fight this together. You do not have to give up everything just because your father is angry." Evan pulled his arm free gently but firmly. He turned to face her, and when he spoke, his voice held no anger, no bitterness, only a calm finality that seemed to strike her harder than any shout could have. "This is not about his anger, Lydia. This is about who I became when I was with you, someone I do not recognize, someone my mother would have been ashamed of." He held her gaze without flinching. "I heard the recordings, all of them, including the one where you told your father you might need to cut me out when this was done. I was never your partner. I was your tool, and I am done being used." Lydia's face contorted through emotions too fast to track: shock, hurt, rage. "You are choosing him," she screamed. "After everything I did for you, after everything I sacrificed." Evan shook his head slowly. "No, Lydia. For the first time in years, I'm not choosing anyone else. I'm choosing myself." He turned back to me, and in that moment, I saw something I had not seen in my son for longer than I could remember. I saw the boy who had once asked me to teach him how to build things. I saw the young man who had believed that hard work mattered more than shortcuts. I saw someone who had been lost and was trying, however imperfectly, to find his way home. My son did not ask me to save him. He did not wait for me to set conditions or demand proof of his sincerity. For the first time in his life, he simply stood up and decided who he wanted to be. The court hearing lasted 3 days. Daniel presented our case with the methodical precision he had applied to every document, every recording, every piece of evidence we had gathered over months of quiet preparation. He walked the judge through the timeline of violations, starting with the dinner where I had been ambushed and pressured into signing papers I had no opportunity to review. He introduced the employee testimonies, the financial records tracing payments to Whitmore Advisory Group, and finally the recordings that captured Lydia and Thomas in their own words, planning and executing a scheme to strip away everything Margaret and I had built. The Whitmore attorneys fought back as best they could. They argued misunderstanding and miscommunication. They claimed that business decisions had been made in good faith, that aggressive restructuring was standard practice in modern corporate environments, that family disputes should not be adjudicated in civil court. They suggested I was a bitter old man who could not accept that his time had passed clinging to relevance through litigation rather than gracefully accepting retirement. But the recordings spoke for themselves. Lydia's own voice filled the courtroom, calm and calculating, describing plans to liquidate the company once they had extracted enough value to clear her family's debts. Thomas coaching his daughter on how to isolate me, how to manage Evan's guilt, how to ensure the old man would be out of the way soon. The paper trail showed hundreds of thousands of dollars flowing to a shell company that existed for no purpose other than to funnel stolen money to creditors who should never have been paid, with funds that did not belong to the Whitmores. No argument could explain away words spoken in confidence by people who believed they would never be held accountable. The judge ruled decisively in my favor on the 3rd day. The temporary restraining order became a permanent injunction. Operational control of the company was restored to me immediately, effective upon the signing of the court order. The fraudulent transfers were ordered reversed where possible, though Daniel had warned me that much of the money had already disappeared into debts that predated my involvement. Some losses could not be recovered, some damage was permanent, but the bleeding had stopped and the company still had a future. Thomas and Lydia were found jointly liable for civil damages amounting to more than they would ever be able to repay. The judgment would follow them for years, garnishing wages, preventing asset accumulation, ensuring that every attempt to rebuild their lives would be shadowed by the consequences of what they had done. Their attorneys spoke quietly to them after the ruling, explaining options that did not exist and futures that had been permanently foreclosed by their own choices. I watched them leave the courtroom. Thomas walked slowly with the shuffling gait of a man whose health had never fully recovered from the stress of public exposure. His suit hung loosely on a frame that had lost weight in all the wrong ways. Lydia walked beside him with her head held high, performing dignity for an audience that no longer believed in her. They did not look at me. They didn't speak. They simply walked out into a world that no longer had a place for the people they had pretended to be. The law. I reflected as Daniel and I gathered our papers was slow. It moved through channels and procedures, required patience and documentation, offered no dramatic confrontations or immediate gratifications. But it was thorough. And sometimes, that was exactly the kind of justice that lasted. Returning to the company was strange at first. The building looked the same, the hallways and offices unchanged from the day I had signed those papers at the Whitmore dinner table. But everything felt different. The air itself seemed lighter, as if a pressure I had not consciously noticed had finally lifted. Employees who remained watched me with expressions that mixed relief with uncertainty, unsure what my return would mean for them, for the jobs they had kept by staying silent during Lydia's tenure. I understood their fear. I had lived with fear myself during those long months of planning. I had no intention of punishing people for surviving circumstances they did not create. My first act as restored leader was to make phone calls, not to lawyers or accountants or board members, but to the employees Lydia had dismissed for being resistant to change, the senior managers who had resigned rather than work under her leadership. The accountant named Patricia, who had been escorted from the building for asking too many questions about consulting fees that should never have existed. I called each of them personally, sitting at Margaret's old desk with a cup of coffee and a list of names I had known for years. I offered their positions back with formal apologies and raises that reflected what they should have been earning all along. Some cried when they heard my voice. Some could not speak for several seconds, overwhelmed by vindication they had stopped hoping for. One manager, a man named Robert, who had worked with us for 18 years before Lydia terminated him, asked if I was certain if this was real, if he was dreaming. I told him it was real. I told him we needed people who remembered what the company was supposed to be. All of them said yes. Long-term clients received calls too. Not from a public relations department crafting careful messages, not from a legal team managing liability exposure, but from me personally. I apologized for the disruption. I explained what had happened without assigning blame to anyone who didn't deserve it. I promised that the company they had trusted for decades would honor that trust again. Most of them stayed. Some who had left during the chaos came back. The relationships Margaret and I had built over 40 years proved more resilient than the damage inflicted by 18 months of greed and mismanagement. Patricia, the accountant who had documented the irregularities that helped prove our case, was promoted to chief financial officer. The senior managers who returned were given advisory roles with real authority, their experience finally valued instead of dismissed as outdated. At the first full meeting of the restored leadership team, I stood before them in the same conference room where Lydia had once held her emergency sessions and said the words I hoped would define everything we did going forward. A company is not a machine, I told them. It is a family, and families heal. Over the following months, I implemented changes that transformed the company into something closer to what Margaret had always envisioned. I created an employee ownership program distributing a portion of annual profits to workers who had stayed faithful during the darkest period in our history. I established a scholarship fund in Margaret's name, providing financial support for children of employees who wanted to pursue business degrees. And in the main conference room, where decisions were made and futures were shaped, I hung a framed quotation in Margaret's handwriting: "A business is not just numbers, it is the people who believe in you." The company was not just saved, it was reborn, stronger than before, more aligned with the values that had created it. Victory, I realized, was not defined by the punishment of enemies. It was defined by the reward of the faithful, by the restoration of trust, by the building of something that would outlast any damage. I had taken back everything they tried to steal. But there was one more thing I needed to do. Something Margaret had whispered to me years ago that I finally understood. 6 months passed before I saw my son again. I'd heard updates through mutual acquaintances, small pieces of information that filtered back to me without my asking. Evan had taken a job at a startup across the city, an entry-level position with a modest salary and no connection to the name he had once relied upon to open doors. He worked long hours for people who did not know his history, who judged him only by what he produced each day rather than what family he came from. I understood exactly what he had asked for. I sent him a message on a Tuesday morning and asked if he would meet me at the coffee shop where we had spoken before. The same place with wooden tables and the smell of fresh pastries, the place that held memories of Saturday mornings when he was young and the world seemed simpler than it had any right to be. He agreed without hesitation. Evan arrived on time, which was itself a change from the man he had been a year ago. He looked tired but clear-eyed, his clothes modest and practical rather than the expensive suits Lydia had always insisted upon. He had lost more weight, but it suited him now. He looked like someone who had been through something difficult and emerged on the other side still standing. "How does it feel?" I asked after we had ordered coffee and settled into the silence that no longer felt uncomfortable between us. "Honest," he said quietly. "For the first time in years, when people respect me, I know it is earned. When they criticize me, I know that is earned too. There is no family name protecting me from consequences or inflating my accomplishments. Everything I do matters because it is mine." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup and stared into it for a moment. I didn't realize how much I needed that until I had it. We talked for 2 hours. About Margaret and the lessons she had tried to teach both of us. About the mistakes we had made, his and mine, the failures of communication and presence that had allowed distance to grow where connection should have been. About what family really meant, not blood or obligation, but choice. The daily decision to show up for people even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. Evan spoke about Lydia without bitterness, recognizing her desperation even as he acknowledged the manipulation she had practiced upon him. The divorce had been finalized 2 months earlier. He did not know where she had gone and did not want to know. At the end of our conversation, I reached into my pocket and placed a small key on the table between us. Evan looked at it without comprehension at first, then recognition flickered across his face. "The lake cabin," I said. "Your mother wanted you to have it. She told me that years ago, long before any of this happened. Not as inheritance, not as reward, as memory." I pushed the key toward him. "She believed in who you could become, Evan. She never stopped believing even when I lost sight of it. This is from her, not from me." Evan picked up the key and held it in his palm as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. His eyes glistened, but he didn't cry. He simply closed his fingers around the metal and nodded once, accepting something more than property, accepting a connection to his mother that had survived everything both of us had done to damage it. That evening, I sat at the desk in my small apartment and wrote a letter I would never send. The paper was plain, the pen ordinary, but the words carried weight I had been accumulating for months. "My love," I wrote, "I finally understand what you were preparing during those final months. Not just the legal protections, not just the documents and clauses that saved me when everything fell apart. You were preparing me to be strong enough to fight when fighting was necessary, wise enough to forgive when forgiveness was possible, and humble enough to rebuild rather than simply reclaim. Our son is not who we hoped he would be, not yet, but he is trying. And trying, I have learned, is the beginning of everything." I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with others I had written over the years, conversations with Margaret that existed only on paper, but felt as real as any we had shared when she was alive. In the weeks that followed, I reorganized the company's succession plan. Evan's name was not on it, not because I had abandoned him, but because he had asked me not to give him anything he had not earned. Leadership would pass to a board composed of long-term employees and outside directors who shared Margaret's values. People who understood that a company was more than profit margins and market share. If Evan ever wanted a role in the future we were building, he would have to earn it like anyone else. That was not punishment. That was respect. The Whitmore family faded into quiet obscurity as the months passed. Thomas's health never fully recovered from the stress of public exposure and legal consequences. Janice retreated to a sister's house in another state, far from the country club she could no longer enter without shame. And Lydia simply vanished from my awareness. I didn't know where she went and didn't care to find out. She had consumed enough of my attention. She did not deserve any more. On a spring morning 1 year after the court ruling, I drove to the cemetery where Margaret was buried. I carried white lilies, the same flowers I still watered every day in the apartment that had finally begun to feel like home. The grass around her headstone was green and carefully tended, and I knelt beside it for a long moment before speaking. "I didn't take revenge," I said softly. "I took back my life. Our life. The life we built together." A bird sang somewhere in the trees above, and I smiled at the sound. "And I finally learned what you were trying to teach me all along. Kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be used, but kindness with wisdom, that is how you change the world." I placed the lilies gently on the grass, touched the stone once, and walked back toward the car, toward a company that was finally, truly mine again. Some people have asked me if I hated them for what they did. I do not. I feel sorry for them, for the fear that made them believe stealing was easier than building, for the desperation that convinced them destruction was the only path to survival. But I'm not naive anymore either. Margaret was right. Kindness matters, but only when you know where to draw the line. That is the legacy I choose to leave behind. Not revenge, not bitterness, just truth boundaries and the wisdom to know the difference. And that is where Richard's story ends. But I want to take a moment to talk to you directly because this story hit me differently than most of the ones we share on this channel. This was not just about revenge. This was not just about a father fighting back against people who tried to steal everything he built. This was about something deeper. Something that I think a lot of us can relate to, even if we have never faced this exact situation. This was about learning the difference between kindness and weakness, about understanding that love without boundaries is not really love at all. It is an invitation for people to take advantage of you. Richard spent his entire life being generous. He built a company with his wife based on relationships and trust. He believed in people. He gave his son every opportunity, every advantage, every benefit of the doubt. And what did that get him? A seat at a dinner table where his own child told him he was too old to matter anymore. A folder of papers designed to strip away 40 years of work in a single signature. A daughter-in-law who saw him not as family but as an obstacle to be removed. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Being kind is not the same as being naive. Being generous is not the same as being a doormat. Richard's wife, Margaret, understood this. She knew that some people do not see kindness as a gift, they see it as a weakness to exploit. That is why she prepared. That is why she left those protections in place. Not because she was bitter or suspicious by nature, but because she loved her husband enough to protect him from the consequences of his own good heart. I think a lot of us, especially those of us who were raised to put family first, to forgive, to keep the peace, we struggle with this. We think that setting boundaries means we are being selfish. We think that protecting ourselves means we do not really love the people around us. But that is not true. The truth is that boundaries are how you preserve your ability to keep giving. If you let people drain you completely, you will have nothing left for anyone, including yourself. So here's my advice. First, pay attention to the people your loved ones bring into their lives. Richard saw the signs. Margaret saw them even more clearly. The fake jewelry, the unsolicited business advice, the way Lydia slowly pushed Richard out of decisions that should have included him. These were not random events. They were a pattern. And patterns always reveal intentions if you are willing to see them. Second, document everything. I know that sounds cold. I know it sounds like something a lawyer would say, not a family member. But Richard won his case because Margaret had prepared documentation years in advance. Because Daniel had organized every piece of evidence with precision. Because Evan, despite all his weakness, had the foresight to record conversations that proved what was really happening. In a world where people can smile to your face while planning to destroy you, documentation is not paranoia, it is protection. Third, understand that forgiveness and accountability are not opposites. Richard forgave his son. He gave Evan the lake cabin that Margaret had wanted him to have. He maintained a relationship with him. But he also did not hand Evan back the keys to the company. He did not pretend that everything was fine, just because Evan apologized. Forgiveness does not mean erasing consequences. It means choosing not to let bitterness poison your own heart, while still requiring people to earn back the trust they destroyed. Fourth, do not let desperation excuse betrayal. Lydia and her family were desperate. They were drowning in debt, watching their carefully constructed image collapse. I understand that. Desperation makes people do terrible things. But understanding why someone hurt you does not mean you have to accept being hurt. You can have compassion for someone's circumstances while still holding them accountable for their choices. Finally, remember what Margaret taught Richard. A legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what you teach others to build for themselves. Richard could have spent the rest of his life bitter and angry. Instead, he rebuilt. He brought back the employees who had been wrongly dismissed. He created programs to share profits with people who had stayed loyal. He turned his company into something better than it was before. That is the real victory. Not revenge, not punishment, transformation, taking the worst thing that ever happened to you and using it to become someone stronger, wiser, more intentional about who you trust and how you protect what matters. If you are watching this and you see yourself in Richard's story, if you have family members who take more than they give, if you have been manipulated by people who claim to love you, I want you to know something. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to demand respect even from people who share your blood. Family is not just about genetics. It is about how people treat you. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, kindness matters, but only when you know where to draw the line. I will see you in the next one.